Before the pineapple became a cheap supermarket fruit, it was a symbol of power so valuable that European aristocrats sometimes displayed one at dinner without ever allowing their guests to eat it. A king was painted receiving one. Wealthy hosts reportedly rented pineapples for parties. Gardeners burned enormous amounts of fuel trying to grow a single fruit inside heated glasshouses. But beneath its golden flesh and natural crown was a much darker empire. Its journey from indigenous farms in South America to royal tables in Europe, industrial canneries in Hawaii, and supermarkets around the world was shaped by conquest, land dispossession, migrant labor, corporate power, and machinery capable of processing fruit on an industrial scale. What began as a carefully cultivated native crop became a colonial status symbol, then the foundation of a plantation economy that reshaped entire islands. The pineapple did not simply travel across the world. It was taken, transformed, industrialized, and used to build an empire disguised as tropical paradise. And if you think a pineapple has an unexpected history, imagine what else is hiding in plain sight. Subscribe to the channel, because every week we uncover the forgotten stories behind the ordinary things that shaped empires, fueled wars, and changed the modern world. Long before European kings displayed pineapples as symbols of wealth, indigenous communities in South America had already spent generations shaping the fruit into the crop we recognize today. The pineapple originated in the tropical lowlands of South America, where native peoples carefully selected the sweetest, largest, and most useful plants. They ate it fresh, used it in traditional remedies, and fermented its juice into drinks. Through migration, trade, and cultural exchange, cultivated pineapple traveled northward into Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. By the 15th century, it was already familiar across much of tropical America. This was not a wild curiosity waiting to be discovered. It was the product of human knowledge, patience, and agricultural skill. Indigenous farmers understood where it grew best, how to reproduce it, and how to move it across long distances. Yet when Europeans later encountered the fruit, they often described it as though its history had begun the moment they saw it. When Christopher Columbus encountered the pineapple on the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe in November 1493, Europeans treated the moment as a discovery. But the fruit had already been cultivated, improved, and carried across the Americas for centuries. Indigenous communities had given it value long before European ships arrived. Spanish sailors called it piña because its rough skin resembled a pine cone, while other European languages adopted versions of the indigenous word ananas. European accounts praised its sweetness, fragrance, and unusual shape, but rarely acknowledged the people who had made the crop possible. This pattern would repeat across the colonial world. Native plants were removed from their cultural origins, renamed, classified, and presented as treasures uncovered by European explorers. The pineapple entered European history not as an indigenous achievement, but as a prize from a conquered world. And because almost no fresh fruit could survive the long Atlantic crossing, its rarity soon made it even more powerful. The pineapple's greatest weakness quickly became the source of its extraordinary value. Unlike dried spices, sugar, or preserved goods, fresh pineapple could not endure months inside the damp, crowded hold of a wooden ship. Heat accelerated decay. Salt air damaged the fruit. Rough seas bruised its flesh. By the time vessels returned from the Caribbean, most pineapples had already rotted. A rare specimen that reached Europe intact was therefore more than something to eat. It was proof of an expensive and successful journey across the Atlantic. To possess one meant having access to ships, colonial ports, skilled crews, and trade networks stretching thousands of miles. Its sweetness mattered, but its improbability mattered even more. The harder the pineapple was to obtain, the more aristocrats desired it. Soon, the fruit began appearing at royal banquets and elite gatherings, where it served as a golden announcement that its owner could command wealth from the other side of the world. By the 17th century, the pineapple had become one of Europe's most powerful edible symbols. It appeared in royal portraits, banquet displays, decorative carvings, and paintings designed to communicate wealth. One famous image showed King Charles II of England receiving a pineapple from his gardener, a scene that presented the fruit almost like a diplomatic gift or royal treasure. At elite dinners, a pineapple might be placed at the center of the table and admired for hours before anyone was allowed to taste it. In some cases, wealthy hosts reportedly rented the fruit simply to display it at social events, passing it from household to household until it finally began to decay. Its value came from more than scarcity. The pineapple looked like royalty, a golden body topped with a natural crown. But beneath that elegant image was a hidden message. Every pineapple displayed in Europe represented access to colonial territory, dangerous sea routes, and a widening global system built to deliver rare luxuries to the powerful. European elites soon wanted more than imported pineapples. They wanted to grow them on their own estates, but producing a tropical fruit in the cold climate of Britain or Northern Europe required an astonishing amount of money and labor. Gardeners built specially heated structures known as pineries, using glass, fermenting manure, hot air, and later furnaces to maintain tropical warmth through freezing winters. The temperature had to remain carefully controlled for months, sometimes years, while skilled workers monitored moisture, soil, ventilation, and disease. A single mistake could destroy the entire crop. Producing one healthy pineapple therefore became a demonstration of technological power as much as agricultural skill. Wealthy landowners were not merely growing fruit, they were creating artificial climates and forcing the tropics to exist inside European estates. The pineapple became proof that money could overcome geography, seasons, and even nature itself. But that illusion of control depended on enormous amounts of fuel, land, and invisible human labor. As the pineapple became associated with wealth, its image spread far beyond the dining table. Carved pineapples appeared on gates, rooftops, bedposts, silverware, ceramics, garden walls, and grand entrances. The fruit became a symbol of hospitality, abundance, and worldly sophistication. To welcome guests beneath a stone pineapple was to announce that the household possessed taste, status, and connections to distant lands. But the symbol carried another meaning that was rarely acknowledged. The pineapple represented an empire reaching into tropical regions, extracting plants, labor, and profit, then transforming them into fashionable objects for European society. Its crown made it look noble, yet its journey was rooted in conquest. The more often its image appeared in aristocratic architecture, the easier it became to forget the indigenous farmers who had cultivated it and the colonial systems that carried it across oceans. The pineapple was no longer merely a fruit. It had become imperial decoration. But the pineapple's future would not remain inside European glasshouses. As colonial empires expanded, merchants and governments began searching for tropical crops that could be produced cheaply and sold on a massive scale. Pineapples were transported across the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, carried along the same routes that moved sugar, coffee, spices, and enslaved or indentured laborers. Botanists studied the plant, plantation owners tested new varieties, and colonial officials measured its commercial potential. The fruit was slowly separated from its indigenous origins and absorbed into a global system of extraction. What had once been a regional crop became something empires could relocate, standardize, and control. Yet the pineapple still faced one major obstacle: it spoiled too quickly. To become more than a luxury, it needed a new landscape, a new labor force, and a technology capable of preserving it. Those conditions would eventually come together thousands of miles away, in Hawaii. By the late 19th century, Hawaii was already being transformed by foreign capital and plantation agriculture. Large sugar estates controlled growing amounts of land, while American and European business interests gained extraordinary influence over the island's economy and government. In 1893, a group dominated by foreign businessmen overthrew Queen Liliuokalani with support from United States military forces. Native Hawaiians resisted the loss of their kingdom, but Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1898. The political transformation strengthened an export economy built around plantations, shipping networks, and access to American markets. Land increasingly became something to be measured by how much profit it could produce. Sugar still dominated, but investors were searching for another tropical crop capable of surviving industrial production. Pineapple appeared perfectly suited to this new order. It could grow well in Hawaiian conditions, command strong consumer interest, and, if preservation technology succeeded, be shipped across the Pacific in enormous quantities. In 1901, a young American businessman named James Dole established the Hawaiian Pineapple Company in Wahiawa, on the island of Oahu. Other growers had already experimented with pineapple, but Dole imagined something far larger. He did not want to sell a few fresh fruits to local markets. He wanted to transform pineapple into a standardized product that could reach ordinary households across the United States. That meant controlling every stage of the process, from planting and harvesting to canning, shipping, and advertising. The challenge was enormous. Pineapples bruised easily, spoiled quickly, and required intensive field labor. Processing them by hand was slow, while transporting fresh fruit across the Pacific was commercially unreliable. But Dole believed industrial organization could overcome the fruit's natural limitations. If pineapples could be processed quickly and packed consistently, Hawaii could become the center of a new global industry. The royal luxury of Europe was about to enter the age of mass production. The breakthrough was not a new variety of pineapple, it was preservation. Once harvested, the fruit could be rushed from the fields into canneries, cooked, sealed inside metal containers, and protected from the decay that had made it a luxury for centuries. Pineapple no longer had to survive the Pacific Ocean. Only the can did. Preserved fruit could travel by steamship, remain edible for months, and wait on grocery shelves thousands of miles from Hawaii. Then machinery accelerated the process even further. The Janaka machine, patented in 1913, could rapidly remove the pineapple's tough outer shell and cylindrical core, preparing fruit far faster and more consistently than hand labor alone. This innovation allowed canneries to process enormous harvests before they spoiled. A fragile tropical fruit had finally been adapted to the speed of modern industry. Pineapple was no longer simply grown and harvested. It could now be manufactured, standardized, and shipped almost anywhere. But the machines did not eliminate human labor. They made it faster, louder, and more demanding. Inside Hawaii's canneries, the air was thick with heat, steam, and the sharp sweetness of pineapple juice. Metal clattered against metal as conveyors carried fruit through cutting machines and inspection lines. Workers trimmed damaged sections, sorted slices, filled cans, cleaned equipment, and packed finished products for shipment. Many repeated the same movement for hours while trying to keep pace with machinery that rarely slowed. Pineapple juice could irritate skin, wet floors became slippery, and the humid buildings grew exhausting during long shifts. Every delay threatened to waste ripe fruit waiting outside, so factory schedules controlled the rhythm of the entire operation. The cannery was celebrated as a triumph of efficiency, but that efficiency depended on workers bending their bodies and their time to the speed of the assembly line. Industrial production could fill millions of cans, but machinery alone could not make Americans buy them. Pineapple companies needed to create demand for a fruit many families had rarely tasted. Beginning in the early 20th century, the Hawaiian Pineapple Company placed advertisements in magazines across the United States, presenting canned pineapple as clean, convenient, healthy, and modern. Recipe booklets taught consumers to place it in cakes, salads, desserts, and holiday dishes. But the companies were selling more than sweetness. They were selling Hawaii itself. Advertisements surrounded the fruit with blue oceans, bright sunshine, palm trees, and visions of effortless tropical abundance. The islands became a commercial fantasy, a distant paradise supposedly waiting to serve the American household. Missing from those polished images were crowded labor camps, exhausting factory shifts, contested land, and the workers who made mass production possible. The label showed paradise. The plantation told a very different story. Behind the tropical advertisement stood a workforce, drawn from across the Pacific and beyond. Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Korean, Filipino, and other laborers were recruited to sustain Hawaii's plantation economy. Many arrived hoping to earn money or build new lives, only to enter a system dominated by large landowners and powerful agricultural corporations. Workers were often separated into camps by ethnicity, a structure that made communication and collective resistance more difficult. In the pineapple fields, they spent long hours bending between rows of stiff, sword-like leaves that could cut exposed skin. Dust filled the air. Tropical heat pressed down on their backs. Harvested fruit had to be moved quickly before it spoiled, allowing factory schedules and shipping deadlines to dictate the pace of human labor. These workers helped transform Hawaii into a global agricultural center, yet their faces were almost completely absent from the cheerful images used to sell the fruit. Paradise was the product. Their exhaustion was kept outside the frame. The plantation system depended on keeping workers divided by language, nationality, and ethnicity. But in 1920, those barriers began to crack. On January 19th, approximately 3,000 members of the Filipino Labor Union walked off sugar plantations on Oahu. Japanese workers soon joined them, followed by laborers from other communities. By early February, roughly 8,300 workers across 6 plantations were on strike, about 77% of the workforce involved. For 165 days, they challenged an industry that controlled not only their employment, but often their housing and daily lives. The companies resisted, and the coalition eventually fractured before winning its major demands. Yet the strike exposed something plantation owners had long feared. Workers recruited from different parts of the world could recognize a common struggle. The uprising failed to break the plantation system, but it created a model of multi-ethnic solidarity that later labor movements would use against Hawaii's agricultural corporations. The Pineapple Empire reached its most dramatic scale in 1922, when James Dole purchased most of Lanai for approximately $1.1 million. His company did not simply build another plantation. It reorganized an island around a single crop. Thousands of acres were cleared and planted in carefully measured rows. Roads, rail lines, water systems, worker housing, warehouses, and an entire settlement, Lanai City, were developed to support production. Immigrant families arrived from the Philippines, Japan, Korea, China, Puerto Rico, and other regions, creating a diverse community whose daily life depended heavily on the plantation. From above, the landscape increasingly resembled an enormous outdoor factory, with nearly every road and field serving the movement of pineapple. Lanai became known as the Pineapple Island and one of the world's leading centers of production. A fruit once grown in small indigenous gardens had now become powerful enough to reshape an entire island. By the 1930s, Hawaii had become the world's leading center of canned pineapple production. Plantations stretched across Oahu, Maui, Molokai, and Lanai, while enormous canneries processed fruit for shipment across the United States and beyond. Success pushed companies to demand greater speed and uniformity from every stage of production. Agricultural researchers selected plants for predictable sweetness, consistent size, and compatibility with factory machinery. Fields were planted in carefully timed cycles so that harvesting, rail transport, canning, and shipping could operate as one coordinated system. Pineapples that ripened unevenly, bruised too easily, or failed to meet processing standards risked becoming commercial waste. The fruit itself was being reshaped to serve the factory. European aristocrats had once valued each pineapple because it was unique and nearly impossible to obtain. Hawaii's plantation corporations pursued the opposite goal: millions of fruits that looked, tasted, and moved through machines almost exactly the same. Then war reached the islands. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Hawaii was placed under martial law, and military authorities assumed extraordinary control over civilian life. Curfews, blackouts, travel restrictions, identification requirements, and military courts reshaped daily routines across the territory. Japanese-American residents, many of whom worked in agriculture or belonged to plantation communities, faced intense suspicion, surveillance, arrests, and in some cases, incarceration. At the same time, wartime manpower shortages placed new pressure on Hawaii's farms and canneries. Pineapple production continued, but the industry operated inside a society governed by military necessity and fear. The plantations still projected an image of tropical abundance to consumers on the mainland, while workers at home lived beneath restrictions few advertisements ever acknowledged. Hawaii's pineapple empire remained powerful, but the war exposed how deeply its factories, workforce, land, and political order had become connected. After the war, Hawaii's pineapple industry climbed even higher. In 1955, planted acreage reached a peak of approximately 76,700 acres. By the early 1960s, Hawaiian growers supplied more than 80% of the world's canned pineapple. From the outside, the empire appeared complete. Its plantations covered vast landscapes, its canneries employed thousands, and its products filled supermarkets across the United States. But this dominance concealed a growing weakness. Union victories had improved wages and working conditions, while land, transportation, and production costs continued to rise. At the same time, corporations discovered that pineapples could be grown and processed more cheaply in the Philippines, Thailand, and other tropical regions. By 1966, production in Hawaii had begun to decline. The companies that had reorganized entire islands around pineapple were now following profit elsewhere. Hawaii had built the industry. But the industry had never promised to remain loyal to Hawaii. But the pineapple empire did not disappear when Hawaii's plantations declined. It moved. Production expanded across the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and especially Costa Rica, where tropical conditions, large plantations, and access to American and European markets supported a new export industry. By the 21st century, Costa Rica had become the world's leading exporter of fresh pineapple. Improved refrigeration, packaging, and shipping allowed fruit to cross oceans without being sealed inside cans. The modern industry now valued pineapples that ripened predictably, survived transportation, and appeared almost identical on supermarket shelves. Fields were planted with highly uniform commercial varieties, while packing houses sorted fruit by size, color, and cosmetic quality. Hawaii had lost its dominance, but the economic model developed there remained familiar: control the land, standardize the crop, accelerate production, and reduce costs. The plantation empire had not ended, it had simply found cheaper ground. And this is where the modern story takes a darker turn. Producing uniform pineapples throughout the year requires large monoculture fields, carefully timed harvests, and intensive control of weeds, insects, and plant disease. In parts of Costa Rica, the conversion of forests and mixed agricultural landscapes into pineapple plantations has raised concerns about biodiversity, soil quality, and pressure on nearby water systems. Researchers have documented pesticide residues in waterways draining pineapple-growing regions, while studies comparing tropical forests with intensive plantations have found declines in important measures of soil health and biological diversity. Heavy rainfall can carry soil, nutrients, and agricultural chemicals beyond plantation boundaries. Not every farm causes the same level of damage, and environmental standards have improved in parts of the industry. But the demand for flawless fruit creates constant pressure to produce more from the same land. The pineapple looks clean beneath supermarket lights. The landscape that produced it may carry costs the consumer never sees. Cheap pineapple also depends on workers whose labor remains largely invisible. Harvesters move through dense rows of stiff, blade-like leaves, bending repeatedly to cut and carry heavy fruit beneath tropical heat. Packing house employees sort, wash, inspect, and prepare pineapples quickly enough to meet shipping schedules and supermarket contracts. Some workers are employed temporarily or paid according to productivity, arrangements that can increase pressure to work faster and make it more difficult to challenge unsafe conditions. Migrant laborers, including workers from Nicaragua in Costa Rica's wider agricultural economy, may face additional vulnerability when employment, housing, or legal status depends on remaining in good standing with an employer. Protective equipment, labor inspections, certification systems, and corporate sustainability programs have improved conditions in parts of the industry, but they have not removed the central pressure. Retailers demand attractive fruit at competitive prices. That demand travels backward through the supply chain until it reaches the person standing between the leaves. By the late 20th century, pineapple had completed one of the most dramatic transformations in food history. Once displayed at royal banquets as proof of wealth, it now appeared in canned fruit, cakes, cocktails, restaurant salads, frozen desserts, and pizza. Advertising had taught generations of consumers to associate its flavor with celebration, summer, and tropical escape. The fruit's old symbolism survived in architecture and decoration, where carved pineapples still represented hospitality and abundance. But the real fruit no longer required a palace, a heated glasshouse, or access to colonial trade. It required only a trip to the supermarket. Industrial agriculture had erased the rarity that once made pineapple powerful. Its victory was not simply that more people could eat it. The greater achievement was that an extraordinary tropical crop had been made to feel completely ordinary. Yet that ordinary appearance depends on an enormous system operating beyond the consumer's view. Before a pineapple reaches a supermarket, growers must reproduce commercial plants, prepare fields, manage weeds and pests, coordinate harvest crews, sort fruit, cool it, pack it, and move it through ports and refrigerated warehouses. Exporters calculate ripeness so that the fruit survives its journey but still appears fresh when it reaches the shelf. Retailers demand consistent size, color, sweetness, and price throughout the year, forcing producers to organize farms around distant market schedules. A pineapple may look like a simple object, but it connects tropical land, agricultural chemicals, migrant labor, shipping companies, customs systems, distribution centers, and multinational retailers. The modern empire is no longer displayed at a royal banquet. It is hidden inside the supply chain that makes distant fruit appear whenever consumers expect it. But the supply chain hides more than labor and environmental costs. It also conceals everything that never reaches the supermarket. Pineapples may be rejected because they are too small, too large, unevenly colored, scratched during harvest, or unlikely to survive the journey in perfect condition. Some can still be processed into juice or canned products, but others lose much of their value before leaving the farm. Inside packing houses and factories, crowns, leaves, skins, cores, and damaged fruit accumulate beside the polished products prepared for export. Researchers and manufacturers are exploring ways to turn these materials into animal feed, compost, fibers, packaging, and other useful products, yet large-scale recovery remains uneven. The flawless pineapple beneath supermarket lights is therefore only the visible end of production. Behind it stands a much larger biological harvest, cut, sorted, graded, and reduced until only the portion that meets the market's narrow definition of perfection is allowed into view. The industry is not without possible solutions. Better water protection, reduced chemical use, stronger labor inspections, more transparent sourcing, crop diversification, and wider use of pineapple waste could reduce some of the damage hidden inside the supply chain. Certification programs and corporate sustainability standards have already improved practices on certain farms. But changing the system remains difficult because responsibility is divided across many hands. Growers say they must meet the prices offered by exporters. Exporters point to contracts imposed by retailers. Supermarkets argue that consumers expect flawless fruit at low prices throughout the year. Consumers, meanwhile, rarely receive enough information to understand what those expectations require at the plantation level. The modern pineapple empire has no single king issuing commands from a palace. Its power is distributed through prices, deadlines, cosmetic standards, and purchasing decisions. That may be precisely why it is so difficult to see and so difficult to challenge. The history of pineapple is ultimately a story about power. Indigenous farmers first cultivated and carried it across the Americas. European elites turned it into a symbol of conquest and privilege. Plantation companies reshaped islands to produce it, while migrant workers and factory laborers made mass consumption possible. When Hawaii became too expensive, the industry moved elsewhere, carrying the same demand for cheap land, standardized fruit, and low-cost labor into a new century. Today, the pineapple no longer announces the wealth of a king. Its price is low, its supply is constant, and its presence feels unremarkable. But that ordinary fruit still carries the history of the people, landscapes, machines, and corporations that transformed it. The pineapple became cheaper, the empire became harder to see, and after 5 centuries of reinvention, the fruit never truly lost its crown.